Thank you to Red Eye, the Photography Network, for partnering with us to produce Season 3 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. Red Eye is a not-for-profit organization with a strong ethical focus, offering support and opportunities to help you advance your photography and your career. Find out more at redeye.org.uk. Welcome to Season 3 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 4, we'll be talking with Laura Boushnak about questions of representation. Laura Boushnak is a Palestinian documentary photographer based in Amman, Jordan. Her work mainly focuses on the Arab world, looking at issues that stem from her own personal experience of gender, education, and the aftermath of war. Laura began her career in 1999 as a photographer for the Associated Press in Lebanon. She then went on to work with the AFP at its Middle East hub in Cyprus and its headquarters in Paris. As of 2008, she has been working as an independent photographer commissioned for editorial assignments by the New York Times and other publications. I wonder, could we start with you just telling me a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
The way I define my work, I'm a documentary photographer. I divide my work into 2 categories: assignments, editorial assignments, and personal projects. For my editorial assignments, I mainly work for the New York Times, where I cover different stories in different countries. I just moved recently to Amman, Jordan. So lately I've been working in the region. And the other part of my work is personal projects, where I work on long-term projects, documenting certain issues and themes.
Okay, great. And you said that you move around to a lot of different countries to do a lot of your documentary work. How do you do that? How do you get into a new place and get a feel for the space that you're working in and figure out how to tell the story? What's your process like?
So for my assignments, when I first receive a phone call from my editor, there's always this panic, oh my God, a new place, new assignments, responsibilities. What if I screw it? What if I can't take photos? All these questions. No matter how many years of experience you have, I always have these doubts and questions, which I think is a good sign because it means I care, The minute I guess that I stop asking these questions, it means like, oh my God, I lost interest in the profession. So the first thing I do is, of course, ask what's the story about. I talk to the journalist that I'm going to work with and I get more information about what we will be working on. And then I start researching the topic a bit or reading more about the country I'm going to. Now, moving to Jordan and traveling across the Middle East, I would say this is kind of my comfort zone. But even though I still need to do a lot of research before going to any place, just to make sure, not to make the obvious mistakes. And I even ask a lot of basic, sometimes for others might sound like silly questions, like what's the dress code, even though I know what it is. But I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything, or perhaps things have changed through the years and so on. So yes, a lot of research, a lot of reading about the place I'm going to. Sometimes I do check other photographers' work just to get a sense of what has been done in the place or on the same topic. I know that some of my colleagues don't like to do that. I know that some would go to the place without having looked at any of the work, but I like to have a look just to sort of get a sense and understand what has been covered before.
That's really interesting. That came up in another podcast interview that's in this season about that, looking at what's been done before and looking at what you can add. And actually, I think that's such an interesting and such an important, really, piece of the puzzle. But it's interesting that you say as well that some of your colleagues would choose not to look at what's been done before.
It's just the approach to work, but everything has been done before, a lot of stories has been done, and that's absolutely okay. Now, the challenge is how you can do the same thing, but in a different way. I think that's always the challenge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And quite a lot of the stories that you photographed, both in your personal projects and your editorial projects that I've seen on your website anyway, deal with quite a lot of important but also difficult or delicate, sometimes social issues. One was on women's literacy, I believe. And there was another one that really grabbed me on the LGBTQ plus community in Amman, was it?
In Beirut, in Lebanon.
In Beirut. You know, how do you approach people in stories like that, you know, to ensure that they feel comfortable and safe to work with you and that they're not going to be in any way compromised through that process?
Well, I think that's also part of our job. So the LGBTIQ piece was done for the New York Times. It was the photo editor's idea. And when she approached me, we agreed, like, listen, a lot of stories has been done about the LGBTIQ communities in the Middle East. But if we're going to do it, I would like to take photos of those who are out, those who can show their identities. I'm not interested of hiding their faces. And that was the first step we took to find people who would accept to be photographed and talk to us. But I think the key to any story that photographers work on is to be transparent with the people you're approaching. Just share with them your intentions, show them what you're working on, why you're doing it, where it's going to be published. And I know other photographers don't like to do that, but especially if it's a sensitive topic, I don't mind sharing the images with the people I'm working with, especially if I'm working on my personal projects. Because this is how I look at it, that people open their houses and they trust me. So the least I can do with them is share with them how I'm going to represent them and publish their work. But here I'm talking more about my personal work, because when you do editorial work, it's a little bit tricky to share the images. So for my personal work, especially because I do write the text as well and I'm quoting people, if I go to an area where I know that what I'm going to publish might put people at risk, I always share with them what I'm going to publish. I think transparency, you have to share with the people what's your story about, where it's going to be published and how. And I think this is how you build trust. When I first started the literacy project, the first country I went to was Egypt. So I took photos of women who were attending literacy programs in the suburbs of Cairo. And some women were hesitant to take part in the project. And when I shared with them that, listen, these images will be shared with other women who might inspire them. So I'm trying to show something positive that you're doing. That's when more women, moved forward and said, okay, we don't mind being photographed. I think also if you're approaching people and saying, okay, we're trying to reflect something positive happening, they also get more encouraged to take part in either the article or the project. But you can approach people and say, hey, listen, we're going to show how miserable your life is. And that's always, that doesn't happen. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you said that it's trickier in editorial projects. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit what you mean by that. Is that because you don't want people to influence maybe the photographs that you're taking, or is there another reason?
Yeah, it's about the influence. As rules, like the writers are not allowed to share the quotes or what they're writing about. Because imagine if people start interfering with editing the piece, then this is not journalism anymore. And then our job is to try to reflect, writing is different than pictures, because with pictures, things are happening in front of me. Sometimes women complain about how they appear. I know, like, one time a woman complained about the lipstick on her face, which was, it's fine. But I remember I had to withdraw a couple of photos from the LGBTIQ projects because one of the subjects changed her mind, which for me, it's fair enough. I know it's annoying when someone changed their mind, but if this is putting their lives at risk, you can't do much about it. And in this case, I would just, follow what the person wants to do. Sometimes I try to find the reasons why they don't want to publish their images. For example, I worked on a story in Germany for the New York Times about 3 Syrian refugee sisters who just moved recently to Germany, and they didn't want to be photographed. So the first question was, does this impose any threats to you or to your family back home? So when we found out that it was just, they didn't want to be photographed because they didn't feel like it, there's no threat. We tried to convince them and they were convinced. We tried to tell them, it's just showing how your life is in Germany, how you're going on. You're just sharing your story with others. It's important. And they accepted. But then if I sense there is risk for someone's life or they might put them in an awkward position in their community, then I back up a bit, I don't push too hard. Just out of, you need to respect people's wish.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point and an interesting distinction as well, about why people might object. And I can imagine it's quite a complicated issue. Yeah, because I guess people also have their own ideas about where photographs are going to go or how they're going to be used, or personal concerns as well, that might seem trivial, to us, but might be quite important to them. And so I think unpacking those things is, I'm sure, quite challenging.
Of course, it's also cultural. Like, for example, in Egypt, a lot of women were scared to be photographed because they have this fear that they'll end up on the internet and someone might take their photos and put them on the heads of, a pornography sites or stuff. They have all these sort of ideas. So you just need to respect and try to, work along these lines.
I think that's a really interesting point. And that's something that actually I talk with charities and nonprofits quite a lot about this, about duty of care that we have once we, take somebody's photograph and then when we're publishing it. And I guess it's something that I hadn't really extended or hadn't really thought about how that might relate to maybe media outlets. Do publications like the New York Times or like other, major media outlets, would they have a system of monitoring for misuse of photographs to sort of challenge that if someone's photograph was misused in that way?
I mean, that's different because there's copyright issues. For example, I know that New York Times resell the images through another agency, assuming that whoever buys these pictures will republish the images to go along with the article, the same text. I guess it's hard. It's hard to monitor these things. How can you? The internet is, my God, it's like an open space. Everybody can use it.
Yeah, and I guess that's one thing as well, is that, even if you find an instance of misuse, sort of the damage is done. If the image has already been misused, you can't really put the cat back in the bag. But on that thread of sort of putting the cat back in the bag, so the woman who withdrew from the story about the LGBTQ plus community in Beirut, she did so before it went to print, correct?
Correct, yes.
So have you ever encountered a situation in which after something is sort of on its route to publication or out in the world, what can be done, or can anything be done in those instances?
I mean, luckily not, but I know other photographers face that problem. I mean, if it's online publications, then you can remove these images. The problem is if they go on print, how can you?
Yeah. No, I think it's such an interesting area of discussion, the idea of, consent withdrawal. Are there any other sort of ethical dilemmas that you faced when you've been producing either your editorial work or your personal projects?
I mean, luckily, no, I haven't faced major problems. And I guess part of it is because, just you explain to people what you're working on. I mean, I never go and pretend I'm not a photojournalist. Never. I always say your work is going to be published in this publication. Yeah, no, I can't think of a certain story, but basically the major issue I face, especially in conservative areas, is that women sometimes don't want to be published. I mean, they don't mind being photographed, but it's the issues with publishing their images. So that's always a challenge that you need to, find a way around it.
It's interesting as well, I guess, if, women are underrepresented in certain communities as well, maybe. And there's maybe, I don't know, a need for people to better understand women's communities in certain countries. Does that resonate or no?
But now with social media, isn't everything online? That's the other
true.
thing. People are owning their own stories, they are telling their own stories.
Absolutely.
I mean, I do remember one of young women, she was like, no, I'm not being published. My father and brother won't accept it. And then I checked her social media account harder. I'm like, are you serious? And it wasn't even private, I'm like, okay, let's talk about this, please. I guess it depends. I don't know.
That's really interesting. Absolutely. Sort of, yeah. No, that's quite interesting.
But I guess now the question is not if they are being published or not, is how they're being represented. That's, I think, also what they fear, how they're being represented.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
I mean, there is much more awareness because of social media. There's much more awareness of what's being published. For example, the region here is represented in the mainstream media. So you have the young generation that are like, no, we want to own our own stories. This is not how we want to be shown to the rest of the world. So I guess, it's more, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was a question about being published, being seen, but now it's like how they want to be represented.
Yeah. Have you ever had a moment sort of, because, it seems like this is something that you're thinking a lot about representation and how people are being represented and how that impacts the work that you do or shapes the work that you do. I guess I'm wondering, where does that come from for you? Have you ever had sort of a moment that really sparked you to think differently or to reevaluate maybe the role of photography?
It's not a moment at all. It's where I come from. I come from a region where it's been misrepresented for years in the mainstream media. So it's tiring when you see certain images reflect the whole region, just typical certain images that, that says, when you think of Arab women, you think oppressed women, conservative religious societies, beaten women, and so on and so forth. But however, I do not approach my work having in mind, I'm going to break stereotypes. Because if I start thinking that way with my work, then, it's a lost battle. The way I approach the stories and my personal work is just, it reflects the way I think. That's all. And that's why it's important to hire local photographers. Of course, international, and I also hate that term, but let's say foreign photographers coming to work in a foreign country, they come in with certain ideas and their background and how they see things. But that's why a local photographer would look at the same story from a different point of view and could add different values to it. I'm not saying we need to stop hiring foreign photographers. It's impossible, especially in areas where there is like censorship, where, let's say, local photographers or journalists can't work, or if they work on a certain topic, their life might be threatened. All what we're saying is people need to do their homework before they go to any place, just to get a better understanding of the topic. And in addition to that, local photographers and journalists would bring a different insight to certain topics, definitely. So we need both. So that stereotypes is coming is just because I read the news and I follow, and certain articles, the way certain areas are represented is annoying. I mean, when you think of Africa, first we say Africa as if Africa is one country. It's like, I've never been to Africa, and you're like, where in Africa? Which country? Yeah, so I think it's just approaching the topic with the way you see it, with the way you understand it. When I did the LGBTIQ story in Beirut, some of the people I took photos of are my friends. So it's like when I went to a bar where they were having, it's not like I had to, think so hard about the story. All I wanted to do is just follow them and what they do during their daily life. And this is how the story folded,
Absolutely. Like, I really appreciate what you said about how, you photograph the way that you think about things. And I think that that's, yeah, like you said, that's true for everybody. And if you, think of Africa as one homogenous country, you're going to photograph different countries in Africa as if it's one homogenous, country and not a continent. It's
and it's tricky. That's the problem. Is young photographers, when they start their careers, they start learning from other photographers. So you feel like there's this pattern of work being copied. So in work coming out of some African countries, you feel it's the same topics covered in the same way. I'm not saying let's not just, let's work on just positive stories. Of course, part of our job is to highlight and focus on problems. But it's the way we portray these problems. I can't stand images that make you feel sorry about the subject. That I can't stand. I don't want anyone to feel sorry about me. I prefer that you show empathy towards the subjects you're working on. That's much more important than just feeling sorry about someone. And also another tricky part with our profession is the sort of images that are allowed to be published and taken in certain countries, but not in other countries. You know what I mean? What photographers allow themselves to do in, let's say, some African countries where they bring young kids and they show them naked. That would never happen in the UK or the US, that you bring an underage child and you ask her to pose in front of you topless. So this is the other, not because no one is going after you and because you're in a country where you know you would get away with it, so you allow yourself to do it. These are the ethics and rules that needs to apply everywhere. And then you think about how such an image would help me tell the story. This is another thing. Because some photographers are so much taken by, taking a different photo or having a scoop and so on. So that's when they start stepping over the ethics and the rules, I think.
Absolutely. And I think it's probably also, at the level of photo editors as well, right? What kinds of photographs not only are they receiving from photographers, but what kinds of photographs then are they willing to publish? And I think that we see a huge discrepancy in, the editorial decisions that are taken in terms of photographing people in pain or suffering or various states of undress or death. It differs greatly if the person is from a low and middle income country, and if a person is a person of color versus if it's a white person from the US. It's a completely different editorial decisions as well.
And it's super, super dangerous because these images are, engraved in our memory. So we think about certain regions in a certain ways because of the images that we often see coming out of these regions. So when there is a suicide attack or an explosion in the Arab world, it's okay to publish dead bodies. But have you seen a single photo coming out from Paris attacks or remember the attacks that happened in London? I can't remember when. But we saw zero images of dead bodies. We haven't seen any. Yeah. So why is it okay to publish certain images from certain countries but not others? That's the thing.
I think that's probably reared its head a bit as well during the COVID pandemic. There's probably been, or there has been, a discrepancy as well in terms of how the pandemic has been represented or how pandemics have been represented when they don't impact, high-income countries versus when they do impact high-income countries. You think about Ebola and how that was photographed. And I don't think you'd ever get a pandemic photographed that way in the UK or the US.
Exactly. No, I agree. I know these are all important questions to be asked and to bring more awareness to the younger generation or photographers just starting their careers to ask these questions.
Absolutely. And along those lines, if somebody was starting out and wanted to go down a similar career route to yourself, what advice would you give them, especially if maybe they haven't encountered super critical discussions about representation yet, or even if they have encountered that, how do they incorporate that into their own practice and internalize that?
I don't know. It's tricky because it depends on, each photographer, their personality, their background. What do they want to achieve with their career? What's their goal? Is it winning awards and getting all the media attention, or is it working on stories that they feel they're important to be told, or it's a mixture of both? I don't know. At the beginning of anyone's career, it applies to me. I went through stages. I made many mistakes. And then when you grow older, you set your priorities. But also in our profession, it's also rejection is a big thing. We have to get used to getting rejected. Because I wanted to become a photographer and I really liked the job. And I know it was quite challenging to, balance between having the financial security, continuing in the same profession. You have to be persistent. That's the thing. Set goals, work on personal projects that mean a lot to you, because you would have these days where you would wake up and you're like, that's it, I'm quitting my job. But then you think about it and think, okay, no, I'll continue.
Absolutely. And could you share anything that you maybe think back on as maybe a mistake, or maybe something that, if you had it to do over again, you might do it differently? You talked about priorities or things like that. Is there anything like that you could share? I
think my mistake, but that comes with young people, that ego, I'm so important. No, I can't do this job, So I regret not taking up an offer to work at a newspaper in Beirut. Now, I think I made that mistake because have I taken that job? It's the best practice I would have done, because working in a newspaper, you would just be sent out every single day in the field to take photos left and right. And this would have been the best training for my eyes. But it's okay. It's not like a major mistake. Yeah, but then with working, the more I worked, the more my ego would just shrink,
That's really interesting. No, that's really interesting. I feel like for some people, it might go the opposite way. the more the work they produce, the bigger the ego grows as well.
No, I think it's that the more you know, the more you learn, the more you find out, like, my God, I know nothing, basically. That's, yeah.
And I like to ask everyone, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Photography ethics, I think we just, mentioned few. They're like the guidelines, because sometimes I am in the field and I'm tempted, like, oh, this photo would have been fantastic if, but then you ask yourself these ethical questions that you shouldn't cross. Also, one time I took a really nice photo, but then the person in the picture approached me and they go like, please don't use that photo. And I was too tired to argue. I didn't even bother. I said, yeah, no, it's okay, I won't use it. But when I was editing, I'm like, oh, that's a really strong image. I wish I could use it. And then you think like, well, what, could I use it? But then you think like, no, I shouldn't, because but maybe the person won't see it. And then you remind yourself, this is the internet. Everybody can see everything.
No, absolutely. I guess that goes back to what you were saying earlier about, transparency and, honesty and, that communication with the people that you're photographing that you were describing earlier.
Because you have to think it's people's interests above your own interests, At the end of the day, I have no right to go to people's houses, take their pictures, share their personal, private lives with the rest of the world. And these people trusted you, so at least show some respect to them. That's the thing.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. The links to all things mentioned in this episode are available in the show notes at www.photoethics.org. Join me next week when we hear from Michelle Pearson-Clark on vulnerability. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to make the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics. This podcast was edited and digitally produced by Ellie Gascoigne.